Welcome to Season 2 of the Bean Pod, a podcast about decentralized finance and the Beanstalk Protocol. I'm your host, Rex. Before we get started, we'd like to again remind everyone that we here at the podcast are super bullish about Beanstalk Protocol and other DeFi projects. But as we've seen time and time again, this is still a risky space. So with that in mind, always do your own research before investing in a project, including anything covered here in the podcast, and never ever invest funds that you can't afford to lose. And with that, on with the show. So for a lot of the Beanpod episodes, we've either interviewed guests or we've talked about projects. But for this episode, we wanted to change things up a little bit. We've got our good friend Ceazor, who is an expert on a wide variety of projects and protocols and has really just become known as a generally smart person to be talking with. And we decided we would sit down and just pick one or two topics on a regular basis to provide a little bit of review on and just give some of our personal insight and maybe wrap in a little bit of news and current events. And we want to try that out for this episode as kind of a first go around. Hey, Ceazor, how's it going?
It's going pretty good. And how are you?
I'm doing well.
All right. I'm pretty excited. Let's talk about the macro stuff.
One of the big things that's happened in the real recent past, we're recording this on February 2nd, but just yesterday, February 1st, the Federal Reserve announced that it raised its rates again. So the Federal Reserve raised its rates by 25 basis points or 0.25 percentage points, which is essentially it's the rate at which it lends money out.
So this is the rate for like bonds or for just like lending to the banks?
Yeah, this is what they call the overnight federal funds lending rate. So essentially, as money moves back and forth in and out of the Fed, any money that's lent has a particular interest rate assigned to it, and that is established by the Federal Reserve. That rate has been steadily increasing to fight inflation. And so the overall goal is to stem the tide of inflation by raising that overnight lending rate with the idea that as that rate gets higher, it essentially gets more expensive to borrow money. And that higher expense for borrowing money will in turn cause the economy to slow in a variety of ways. And the goal is to try to hit some kind of sweet spot between a slowing economy that will in turn cool inflation and some type of recessionary backlash. You know, the problem is that if it gets too expensive to borrow money, that economic growth will slow down so much that we could enter some type of recessionary environment. And so this is really the broader question that we're looking at from both like a general macro standpoint and from the crypto space is, is the US economy in a place where we're moving towards a recession? Is the Federal Reserve doing what they should be doing to help manage inflation but avoid a recession? And then in turn, what does that look like in crypto? Is a recession going to have an immediate impact on crypto investing? And if so, how long does that impact last? So I guess the first thing that goes through my mind along these lines is that we know that crypto is considered a risk-on asset. It is a place where right now a lot of individuals look for speculative gain. And so when the economy is not doing quite as well, people tend to look for safer investments, things like government bonds. And so overnight rate goes up. And there's talk about it potentially reaching as high as 5 or 5.5% to manage inflation. Will that continue to drive dollars out of riskier assets and into more safe ones.
Well, based on what you're saying here, it kind of makes me think a few things. Like, first of all, let's kind of like translate everything you've said into like crypto terms. So, like basically, the Fed, if you can think of it, like they have the ability, if they were compound finance, to just change the interest rate of everything that's borrowed, right? Like, let's say there's only one token on compound, it's USDC, and people are borrowing it, right? So they've raised it from, you said 4 until 4.5 or something like this, or 4.75.
4.5 to 4.75. Yep.
475. So basically, what that's doing, like you said, it's making it more expensive to borrow. But in essence, what they're trying to do is they're trying to call in debt, right, to people who've already borrowed. They're encouraging them to repay their debt, right, to give back money to the Fed, and then the Fed will just hold it, or in essence, maybe even burn it, right, like kind of take it off of the circulating supply. I'm not sure if they do that or not. Maybe you can speak on that. Like when people repay the Fed, do they just hold those dollars in a bank account somewhere, or do they actually reduce the supply of USDC or USD in the world?
Yeah. So there are probably a few different ways that the Fed can affect the money supply, and probably a lot of them are over my head and kind of outside of the bounds of normal conversation. But I think the big tools that they typically use, or at least the things that we hear a lot about, are quantitative tightening and quantitative easing. And so right now, we're going through a tightening phase where the Fed is trying to remove liquidity from financial markets. And usually they're doing that by selling treasury bonds, or they're just letting them mature and they're not necessarily replacing them. And so that, you know, through that process, liquidity on markets goes down. And so, how about we transition back to that idea of so you were relating it in terms of crypto and like what that would mean for an analogous scenario on chain.
Yeah, this is what the part that's confusing me. Like if they're pulling back debt, right? So then that's reducing people's ability to leverage up on stuff. So therefore, they are reducing their risk on assets, right? Because there's just less money flowing around for them to throw around, right? So then, why does why did the markets, our markets, pump as a result of them raising the interest rate? To me, it seems counterintuitive. Like, is it like it could be just like the people are like had enough of this guy and they're like, let's get out of here, or is this something that should be expected? To me, it's counterintuitive that it should not be expected.
Yeah, that's a great point. And how I interpret this is that there are there are market expectations around what those increases in rates will be. And all the news leading up to the meeting yesterday said that there was going to be an increase of about 25 basis points, this quarter of a percent increase. And the impression that I get from the market's reaction is that what happened was what was expected. So we have seen in the past, we've seen rates that have been increased by more than expectations. And that's usually when we see the market dump. And so, yeah, the fact that they went from 4.5 to 4.75 aligned with expectations. And in general, I think the market saw that and said, whew, all right, that is not as big of a hammer as they could have used to help manage inflation, and so we're happy about that. And in turn, that's why we saw the market pump.
Well, that's interesting. Well, while you were talking, I thought of like another possibility as well. Is that like if they are like burning the supply, then that in essence should increase the value of all assets, right? Because the price should stay the same, but the US dollar is therefore worth more. So maybe people trying to get in before the burn, you know what I mean?
Sure. Well, and in the I think the where is the U.S. economy headed in general, and then what does that matter for us in the crypto world? So, what I seem to be seeing just through general reading is that there's a lot of work going into managing this tightrope walk between ongoing inflation driven by an increase in money supply and overall economic health and stability. Everybody is working together to kind of walk this tightrope. The Federal Reserve being one of those the primary drivers around this balance. And in general, it seems like even despite all this work, the sentiment seems to be that we are headed into some type of recessionary environment probably later on this year. And I want to kind of couch that with we actually have seen GDP information. We just saw it here, just a few days ago for Q4 of 2022, and there was still growth in the economy. I believe it was 2.9% growth during the fourth quarter of 2022. And so, that's good news. But I think there's still this looming potential recession on the horizon. And it seems like there are a couple potential outcomes or approaches. One potential outcome is that obviously one is that we go through a recessionary period, we see negative growth in terms of GDP. There are all the bad things that come with that, especially when it comes to like risk management and people changing their investment profiles and portfolios, and potentially crypto seeing a more difficult period during that time because of more conservative investing habits. That's definitely one possible outcome. Another outcome is that there may be the possibility of, like, let's say, like pushing a recessionary environment down the road. And that almost seems to be what I'm seeing. It's a combination of, pushing this potential recession further out into the future. And while that's happening, working to manage the effects of it if we eventually get there. So, when the pandemic was happening and stimulus was pumping money into the economy, there were a lot of folks who are saying, "Hey, like this is not. We're going to overheat the economy. The only option is going to be the Fed raising rates, and this could create problems in terms of economic growth later on." And it seemed like there was a lot of fear, especially in early 2022, late 2021, that we could be in a recession as early as mid 2022.
Can we go back to the kicking the can down the road? Like basically, does Powell or like the chairman, right? Does he get replaced like a normal election process, or has he been in that office for 20 years and likely to be there for the next 10 years? Like that makes a huge difference, right? Like if he's going to be replaced in 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, then he's more likely to kick it down the road and go, "That's not my problem." Then you know what I mean? I'll just stay it off until I retire. You know what I mean?
So the Fed chair is appointed by the president and then confirmed by Congress. They serve 4-year terms, but they don't have term limits. So there are Fed chairs that have served for long periods of time. I know Alan Greenspan was Fed chair for a long, long time. So, a political appointee, but one that can span multiple presidents or different political parties being in power. So, to your point about can kicking, I don't think that's necessarily a factor here. And like to pivot back to that thought for just a second, I think the thought process is, if originally we were going to see a recession in 2022 and everybody thought it was going to be late 2022 and everybody thought it was going to be really bad, they've been able to potentially, by really being careful about how the Fed rate has been increased, they've been able to sustain positive growth, kick the can down the road. And while that's happening, that gives all the other parts of the economy extra time to navigate and recover. One of the things that that I think about is all the supply chain issues that we were dealing with during the pandemic and then immediately thereafter. When you everything from, toilet paper to semiconductors, we were dealing with all these supply chain problems. But with the economy being able to, with the economy having some time to recover without moving into a recessionary environment, these pieces have had a chance to to heal a little bit, if you will. The best example that I can think of are semiconductors and chips. For months, even after the restrictions of the pandemic, the main restrictions of the pandemic were lifted, we were still hearing about supply chain issues, and automakers had cars that were piling up at facilities that were ready for delivery except for their control chips. And now we're starting to hear more and more stories about those chips being delivered, vehicles being delivered, and some of those supply chain issues as a whole are starting to find relief. And so as the economy navigates, when I think back about the crypto space, I think, okay, we may be able to navigate this space as well and not see such a shocking turn from higher risk assets as I think we had originally anticipated.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like at least crypto doesn't have like supply chain issues, but at the same time, like people who are, looking at diverse portfolios, like large funds and large players and so forth that are in all of it, right? Instead of just degens on, trading coins, they they do consider it a risk on asset, and they're not going to move from like Tesla stock or something, like someone who has a supply chain issue, into like, you know Ethereum, or even like some like crazy altcoins, right? So I think it, like, when they see that they're less risk on assets, like something like a Tesla stock, which is still quite volatile, right? But when they see that is quite comfortable, then they kind of consider exploring crypto. Whereas I think we would kind of hope that that correlation goes away, and that people don't consider like crypto to be the step after like your Teslas and your Microsofts and or Facebook stocks and stuff like this, right? So I'm hoping that, I think we all hope that we separate from that, but it's tough when it comes to like the large players, when they're the people who are moving vast amounts of money and causing the tide to rise or slow, right? Because I don't think like anyone who works at BlackRock is using any of BlackRock's funds to buy like some random shitcoin, right? Like they're just buying the blue chips, if that, right?
Yeah, I agree. And the other thing that is worth keeping in mind here, and I've been talking about inflation, that's also something that we have just gotten, some insight into, is that inflation is slowing. So, consumer price index, last report we saw, so rose at an annual rate of 6.5%. And so that's in line with expectations. And I don't think there are a lot of folks that would say that's good. I mean, that it's not that inflation is going down. We're not in like a deflationary environment, but it is rising not as fast. And mid 2022, early 2022, we were talking about like a 9% CPI. So to be back to 6.5, and knowing that the target for inflation is usually considered, somewhere around 2 to 3%. Knowing that we're headed back towards that, I think, is another positive sign for folks that are trying to manage their risk and potentially willing to look at assets that have a little bit more risk and opportunity along with them.
When you say like inflation's still going, right? So the Fed has hiked rates to borrow, but there are like TradFi degens that are like, yeah, I'm okay with that. I'll still borrow that. I can beat that in the markets. I can beat that in whatever asset they want to speculate on or invest in, right? They're still borrowing the money from the Fed. Like the Fed is actually not breaking back anything. People are not paying back debts, even though the interest rate is rising. Is that the consensus? If inflation is positive, then that means people are still borrowing from the Fed, right?
Yeah, so when a treasury bond or any treasury security matures, the holder gets the face value and then any remaining interest payment. Now, keep in mind that they've also been getting interest payments throughout the life of that bond. So they may have been, getting payouts every 6 months for some interest percentage right along the way. But then when it matures, the bond is paid out in terms of total value, and then whatever interest is still there. And then a lot of times it's just kind of reissued from the government. So kind of just, it's just this continuous debt cycle. The piece to keep in mind here is that more broadly and almost philosophically, it's not really in the United States' best interest to necessarily even pay back those debts because the the debts themselves become monetized and tradable. And so, that's where you get this idea of being able to purchase and sell bonds that have a specific interest rate. The idea is that even once these bonds are mature, they're still they're a low risk yield bearing asset. And so, the thought of this, even the thought of those bonds being paid back is there's a low expectation that those bonds will be paid back. They certainly they could be. People could choose to trade in bonds for face value and collect on them, but it's almost in an investor's best interest rather than to cash bonds in, instead to hang on to them and enjoy the yield that they bear.
When someone does decide to cash in a bond, whoever that person might be, right, or entity, does the government then print them the value of that bond, or is that money somewhere that needs to be sent to them? Like, do you understand what I mean? Like, the bond is with the printer, or the bond is with someone who borrowed who basically took that money and went to use it somewhere. Do you know what I mean? Like, there's two kinds of debts. Like, you can have a debt with a protocol where after that time is up, they will just print those tokens and give them to you, like an Olympus bond, right? And then you have debts where, I will pay you interest on the stuff you've lent me, but I'm going to go take that stuff and degen with it. So which is the case for the government bonds? Like, are they using that money somewhere, or are they just going to print it when the bond is up?
So, good example is 10-year treasury bond, and it does pay out the face value to the holder at maturity. The So pays out its interest rate over its term on six or every 6 months, and then pays out face value at maturity. So it's not the idea that the bond continues to bear yield after it matures, but it's that the once the face value is paid out, they're almost immediately, essentially, in a practical sense, they're almost immediately replaced by additional bonds. So in other words, the lending process continues
Yeah, I understand
from
completely.
the government.
Yeah, it's just like, instead of like, it's like just zapping right into another position, right? Like, just repay and rebond all in one like transaction, pretty much, right? Like, for the most part, right?
More or less. And then during their life, the value will fluctuate based on nearness to maturity. So think think about it this way: the that 10-year bond will have not only will have its face value, it'll also have its potential to earn yield, and the value of that bond will change over time based on how close it is to maturity.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, because people will be able to cash it in and get that money immediately. So,
Yeah, and the closer it gets to maturity, the closer it gets to face value.
mm, it makes sense because there's no risk then, right? It's lowering the risk, right?
That's it. Yep. Yeah, and it's lowering the potential return. So eventually, if you buy a 10-year bond that's got X number of percentage and you buy it right at its issuance, you will potentially be able to take advantage of the entirety of that interest as it's issued. But as it gets closer to maturity, the amount of interest that you'll be able to accrue, or that you'll be able to capture, goes down, and therefore the value of the bond goes down until it gets to its face value.
Okay, so it's not like a share token. It's more like a vault share token where the yield is added into it, and then when it matures, you get the full amount of the value that was ever accumulated. No, it's actually more like a dividend piece where you it holds like say $100,000, and every month, every term, every quarter or whatever, they pay interest to you. So it's cash yielding, right? It's
Yes,
okay. Okay,
that's
yeah,
it.
that makes a huge difference
Yep.
there.
Yeah. So if you were to buy $100,000 worth of 10-year bonds at 3.5% interest, I can't do the math fast enough in my mind. But let's say that the total interest to be paid out over the life of $100,000 investment is $4,000. That you would be able to.
Get a couple $100 a month or something like this. Yeah, yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
And as you get closer to the maturity date, the closer the actual value, or the trading value, gets to $100,000, because I'm not going to buy $100,000 worth of.
$100,000 worth.
Yep, I'm going to buy based on how much interest I can accrue over the remaining life.
Otherwise, it's just a transaction for nothing, right?
That's exactly it.
Yeah. Um, there was something I heard about recently that kind of is quite macro, and maybe we can kind of talk about this. And it's similar in this sense, and I think it can have some influence on crypto if it were to come to fruition. And basically, there was a couple bills that I heard were getting like thrown around. I don't know. It might have been a couple months ago. You might remember this or know of this, and that is that they were considering talking. They were talking about the idea of dismantling the entire IRS and just putting a consumer tax on everything. So instead of tax rate of whatever it is in whatever state you're in, or let's say 5%, 4%, 13%, maybe they would jack that up to 30%, 40%, and then just use that to basically pay the government's needs, right? Like to for all the government's costs, right? So I thought about this in relativity to crypto, and like the IRS is pretty rough. Like nobody likes having to deal with it. I've even gone so far as to say that like the purpose of the IRS is to create accountant jobs. Like the the difficulty to navigate the IRS has created entire sectors of employment for people. Like to basically master this crazy system and then help you to just navigate it safely, right? So like if they were to dismantle the IRS, it would kind of kind of destroy that industry, right? So there's that consideration. But as a crypto person, if there was no IRS and it was just purely consumer tax, I wonder if they would still be like every time you buy and sell crypto on chain, you have to, submit that we have to tax that. Or just basically the idea that every time you convert any of that stuff into fiat, into our money that you want to spend in our country, then we will tax that. What are your
Yeah.
thoughts on this?
Yeah, that's an interesting concept. I think there's kind of two things at play there. One is, kind of your first point. I I don't think there are a lot of folks really, regardless of where they sit on the political spectrum, that would say that, man, not only is the IRS knocking it out of the park, they're also really easy to work with and things are straightforward. I mean, I think there's a lot of general agreement that the IRS is kind of an arcane or difficult organization to navigate with a lot of very complex regulations and rules and inner workings and groups. And so to your second point, I think the broader question is there a way to achieve the goals that a particular government has that are more straightforward? And so, when you think about the crypto space and who lives and works inside of it, I mean, you've got such a broad spectrum, and really, admittedly, it's one of the things that I enjoy about it is that you almost kind of see both sides of the spectrum. You see folks that are very progressive in terms of their political views, and see crypto as a place to build. I'm going to use the term equity, not in the financial sense, but in the social sense. To give underserved or underbanked individuals and people groups an opportunity to use systems that can help them succeed. So that's a very progressive stance. And then on the extreme other side, you've got extremely conservative folks that are very suspicious of the government and have very little trust in public institutions, and say, I want to be involved in cryptocurrency because this is something that I can have control over. I don't it's trustless. I don't have to trust that someone else is going to take care of my money for me. I have the ability to manage this. And so both of those concepts are kind of at play here. And you've got the IRS doing its thing, trying to effectively provide revenue for the federal government through taxation. Whether or not is effective, I, whether or not it's effective, I think that's there's probably a lot of folks that would probably debate that it's certainly not efficient. And is it effective or not? Not completely sure. But the idea of like pivoting to something like consumption tax offers the possibility of a system that is more straightforward. And so consumption taxes, like a lot of other like simplified tax codes, basically latch onto the idea that I'm only going to be taxed on what I consume. Like the first one that comes to mind is like sales tax. I mean, that's essentially a consumption tax. And the the implications of that are that the process is supposed to be straightforward. They're like it's not a system where like I'm trying to do my income taxes, which I'm trying to do my income taxes right now, and I'm looking back at my IRL wages that I earned during the year, and then looking at crypto investments and working with an accountant and trying to, navigate really, really sometimes very confusing laws and regulations and trying to get it right so that I can be legal and and everything's copacetic. Whereas if you move to something like a consumption tax, you're taxed on the spot or at the point of consumption of a good, or when you're purchasing a consumption driven good, and you just say, that's it. That's the tax that I pay. And I think, a couple questions that linger. One is, how broad and how large would a consumption tax have to be to meet the needs of the federal government? Because
Well, I think it would reduce like the needs as well at the same time. Like you can't just say, "Oh, the government needs this much money now," And how are we going to get that much money by doing this taxation system? Because, like, for example, the entire IRS would be almost nullified. Like, you would only, the consumption tax would only need to be, you would only need to regulate or watch or police or whatever you want to call this, the business owners, and that's orders of magnitude lower than the uh, the consumers, right? So, like, it's just you. The consumer doesn't have to worry. He goes into the store. He says, "Oh, a bag of chips is, you know, $4, $6, whatever." Right? That's what it is, and that's all he cares about. He just pays it. Now, the only person who has to worry about the government getting their share of that is the business owner, not the thousands of people that are going into the store every day buying stuff. So the government doesn't need to deal with them, right? It just needs to deal with those individual businesses. And then in the fact that, like, a consumer doesn't need to spend all that time. They don't have to audit anything. They don't have to check anything. They don't have to. There's a lot less trust. If they do decide to audit anything, then it's audit a business, right? Instead of audit, which one of these, millions of individuals should we audit, right? So I think it would reduce this a lot as well, right?
Well, and the other piece of that is that you could even make it more straightforward if there was, kind of an automatic pass through system. And, really, when I think about a consumption tax, I think about sales tax. And right now, like the, I mean, that tax could be applied at point of sale. If you're in a truly digital economy in the future, you could apply that tax at the point of sale, and theoretically, you wouldn't necessarily even need to audit at the business level or to manage at the business level. But the trade off there is that I think that's a system like that would be putting an increasing amount of trust in a government system that actually implements that taxation. And so, yeah, I mean, you raise a good point about, like, what is a fair way to manage a system like that. And the the other thing that goes through my mind is, what are the other forces that keep some of these systems in place? Is that, like, there is I feel like the argument that I've heard in the past about um changing to fully electronic tax filing systems in the US. um the One of the biggest arguments that I've heard against that has to do with CPAs. So CPAs have a very strong lobbying group, and they have managed to successfully avoid using a strictly paperless system to file taxes.
Yeah, yeah, it's just people keeping their jobs, right? Yeah.
I think that is probably an important consideration to keep in mind, is that there are folks that, whether the system's arcane or not, they are personally tied to it and vested in it and have an interest in seeing it continue.
Yeah, of course, of course. That's the way with all things, though, right? If the government does do like a CBDC, right, then that would basically solve the idea of having to ask business owners to pay, pay their taxes, because, like you said, it would just be automatically deducted from the transaction, and that's not even something that, like, Visa couldn't do. You know what I mean? Like, Visa could also do that for the government, or any of the bank, like ATM transactions, stuff like that. But I do think, like, like, there is a lot of inefficiency in the government in that sense. And sometimes I speculate or think about the ideas of, like, a DAO run government. And I've even tweeted in the past, and people say, "Oh, that's never going to work," or people say, "Yeah, that's cool and that's great." And just the idea that, like, individual, like, entities of the government could instead be DAOs, right? Like, it's pretty utopian in our eyes, because we love crypto so much. But it could be done as DAOs. Like, if you have an interest in you know I don't know, waste management, like the sewer systems, and you have an expertise in that, then you just join the DAO, right? And you get paid with, like, basically revenue. So the government collects, their US dollars from the taxation system, and they just fund these DAOs, and then the DAOs use that to pay the individuals who contribute to the DAO, right? And there could be tokens if they wanted. You could use token systems, tokenomic systems inside those DAOs to buy back the token, so that like every dollar that is given to this DAO or this entity basically increases the value of everybody who's part of that DAO. But I start to think about like the problem of like people who take jobs for the most part want consistency, or they crave uh, stability and security, right, in their lifestyle, right? So they're willing to take less money in a sense, perhaps on the grounds that they will continue to get that money for a long time. So what I found in DAOs is they tend to be a little bit fickle, and people come and go quite often. Like it's quite, it's very trendy, right? Like they jump around from trend to trend. So I'm wondering if like a DAO that runs, that manages and runs all the sewage and water treatment of a city would in fact be stable and not, crumble. You know what I mean? Because it can't, right?
And I mean, it seems like that is something that, we think about Beanstalk, that's something that we've been talking about a lot, here over the last month or so. How do you govern a DAO in a way that's sustainable, even with transients and folks that, that are here for a short while, and while things are hot and interesting, but when projects cool, or when things take longer than expected, interests change. Is there a way to maintain that that level of engagement? Because yeah, I mean, crypto projects, you know can kind of, to a certain extent, can kind of come and go, but sewer systems, it's a whole different ball game. You need, if you're going to have a group like a DAO that could theoretically manage, a public works system or any type of like critical infrastructure. Yeah, you can't run into problems of low engagement, because that turns sour pretty quick, literally.
The only way to get around it would be to allow the upcoming of several DAOs, like perhaps the actual physical infrastructure is owned by the government, and then the maintenance, or the running of that infrastructure is granted to several DAOs, and they compete for the larger portion of that budget in a sense. So then there is some market forces, but DAOs kind of can really swing a lot on popularity. Like, someone who's popular in the space gets a much more vibrant DAO than someone who just runs it efficiently in some senses. You know what I mean? But if it is efficient and it is doing the job and it is getting the work done, then I wouldn't see why not. Like it, because it would have to be the problem with like the public works system that I see in the government is they don't answer your questions. Like I recently got a bill for my one of my children, and the bill I was like, basically you need to pay this amount of money because your kid stays here at lunchtime, and we have to hire someone to monitor your kid at lunchtime. So I sent them an email and I said, okay, can you answer me some questions about transparency? I said, like, some of the questions were like, why doesn't the homeroom teacher do this? How much are you guys paying an hour to these people? How many students are in each of those people? And, stuff like this. And, just how did my bill, how did that number, how did you come up with that number? Yeah, like, yeah, exactly. Like, how does this add up to paying those people? And they basically didn't answer me at all. They just said, oh, your child is here and you have to pay this thing. So I'm like, that's a problem, but you won't see that in a DAO. You know what I mean? Like, you might see it in some DAOs, but if the DAO is run properly, then you would get your answers. You know what I mean? Like, oh, okay, that makes sense. This person, and I suspect it's just like entitlement. Like, I don't understand why the homeroom teacher cannot just like she's not feeding them. They're not babies. You know what I mean? She just needs to sit there, right? So we're paying someone to just sit there. And I just didn't understand why this was a necessity and why the tax dollars doesn't cover this if it is a necessity.
Yeah, that's a really interesting thought, and yeah, I think entitlement might be a component, and then just ease in terms of, man, that's a really thorny question, and I don't know if I want to get into it. Here's something of a form answer. Have a good day, and and hope that you're satisfied.
Yeah, I hope that I go away pretty much. Yeah, totally. Yeah. And I did.
So
I did go away because I got bags to manage, right?
that's
I got
right. You got to
tokens to
manage those
harvest.
bags. Caesar, as always, great to talk with you. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, I appreciate it. Thanks for having me, and we'll do this again as much as possible.
The Bean Pod is a production of Beanstalk Farms, a decentralized autonomous organization. You can find us on Twitter, Instagram, Medium, Discord, and our home on the web at bean.money. You can also find me on Twitter at RexTheBean. And as a final reminder, this podcast is not financial advice. Thanks again for listening.